how does the individual organism try to adapt by controlling some parts of its environment? And, like I as people know, I dislike culture. I hate culture. I never write about culture, and I don't think it's important.
Hate culture.
No more culture. Kill the culture in you.
This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Owen, and here with me today is Gil.
Hello.
Will.
Hey.
And of course, Lily.
Hi.
So today we're going to be discussing Sigmund Freud. We've talked about addressing psychoanalysis on the podcast since the very beginning, but I've yet to do an episode on it. And after preparing to host this episode on Freud, I think I know why it kept getting deferred. Psychoanalysis is an entire complex field of inquiry and therapeutic practice, and none of us are scholars or even amateurs in this field. But its importance in the social and political thought of the 20th and 21st centuries, even apart from its manifold epistemic and practical merits, obliges our attention. Freudian psychoanalysis has exerted enormous influence on the history of left theorizing, from Frankfurt School Marxism to French existentialism and phenomenology, from Frantz Fanon to contemporary philosophy of race, and through Jacques Lacan to the work of 𝙤𝙤𝙙𝙬𝙗, Alain Badiou, and the Slovenian circle, including our boy Slavoj Žižek and 𝙁𝙤𝙙𝙬𝙗𝙬, among others. I just want to say, by the way, that we've got a couple more episodes in the works, one on Lacan Seminar 7 and The Ethics of the Real by Žižek.
Sorry, don't be that, bro. It's just like, y'all can't see Lily. She's like, we do? What?
I made the decision by fiat.
Okay.
We love a dictator.
Listen, we all have plans.
All right.
Fair enough.
It could be in years to come. Who knows? All right. In an essay on Freud's theory of instincts, Herbert Marcuse offers a simple, compelling justification for treating psychoanalysis as a central area of inquiry in social theory, which is the following. The psyche is a component of the social totality. That's how he puts it. It is both shaped by that totality and, to some extent, lots of arguments about the extent, it shapes that totality too. This, of course, means that no social totality can be adequately understood without understanding the psychic life of the subjects who practically determine it. It is for this reason that social theorists have so frequently turned to psychoanalysis to help explain facets of social behavior, of individual and collective desire that seem to elude other explanatory frameworks seeking to make the social totality intelligible. The book that will guide our discussion today, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is a pivotal text in Freud's mature elaboration of the structure of the psychic apparatus and psychic life. It's a difficult text, but one which sees Freud either introduce or further develop some of his most important and well-known concepts, such as the death drive, the compulsion to repeat, as well as his famous analysis of the Fort Da game played by his grandson. Philosophers have been especially drawn to this text because, as Freud admits throughout it, he allows himself to indulge a more speculative line of thinking than his fidelity to the evidence of clinical experience would normally permit. For me, it offers as many astonishing insights as it does real head scratchers. So before discussing it together, I want to provide you all with just a basic account of what Freud's doing in this long essay. What Freud calls the pleasure principle is the tendency on the part of the psychic apparatus to minimize excitation. Somewhat counterintuitively, pleasure for Freud names a decrease of excitation, unpleasure, an increase of the same. Freud disagrees with those who assert the dominance of the pleasure principle in psychic life. The most that can be said is that there is a, quote, strong tendency towards the pleasure principle, end quote. But this tendency exists in relation to other psychic and libidinal forces over which it does not dominate. The essay therefore seeks to go beyond the pleasure principle and to investigate these psychic and libidinal forces. One of these forces is the compulsion to repeat, or the repetition compulsion. As an example of this compulsion in the behavior of children, Freud analyzes a game he witnesses his grandson playing. Using a string and wooden reel, the child would throw the reel out of sight behind a curtained baby crib, uttering fort, German for gone, and then pull it back toward him while joyously uttering da, there. The meaning of this game of disappearance and controlled reappearance, Freud claims, is obvious. It is a response to the disagreeable experience of his mother's frequent departure from the home. In the game of fort da, the child seeks and recreates the painful experience of departure and return, with the crucial difference that he now senses himself active in relation to this experience, rather than merely passively enduring it. This active element is how pleasure is found in unpleasure. For Freud, this compulsion to repeat, this drive to relive a painful experience, presents itself in adults in the form of neuroses. He gives the example of war neuroses, in which soldiers return to scenes of trauma in their wish-fulfilling dreams, the example of people who pursue friendships that always end in betrayal as if the betrayal itself was their aim, of amorous relationships that always take the same disappointing route. The child playing fort da, the neurotic patients Freud treats, all point towards the operation in us of a drive that appears distinct from our vital sexual drive. This distinct drive is the famous death drive. So in opposition to other concepts of our libido, particularly what he refers to as the monistic Jungian conception of libido, Freud proposes a dualistic conception. Yeah, thumbs down.
Boo, young. Boo.
No, this is not a young Stan podcast, right? Libido is divided into life drives and death drives, eros and thanatos. And his attempt to account for the origin of the death drive is when the text gets real speculative. While we should not read him as doing kind of baseless pontification, he draws from biology and clinical experience in order to put forth a number of hypotheses that he himself admits do not carry the scientific weight he attributes to other facets of his theory. His central hypothesis is that organisms emerged at some point in history from inorganic matter, and that they possess the inherent drive to return to that inorganic state. And hence his famous quote, "The aim of all life is death." The speculative theory also includes an account of the development of the simplest unicellular organism, a vesicle, which over time, Freud claims, needed to develop a protective cortical layer so as not to be utterly destroyed by external forces, a shield against external excitation. As a higher organism, humans are actually besieged on two fronts: stimuli from the external world, whose intensity our sense organs work to limit and diminish, as well as excitation from within, libidinal excitation, against which, Freud claims, the psyche has no comparable shield. So in the absence of a shield, our psyches have evolved complex mechanisms for binding that energy, that libidinal energy, to channel it, to educate it, to displace it, to make it quiescent. Whatever the faults or merits of the origin story, the psychic economy that it allows Freud to sketch provides social and political theorists, I think, with a vision of the subject that has as much or more explanatory power as like rational actor theories or accounts of the economic subject of self-interest, and certainly more than monistic accounts of will to power or lust for domination. Right? Many social and political theories look to some kind of account, some explanation for why it is that that we pursue the things that we pursue. And I think psychoanalysis has an excellent answer to that question, for all its potential faults, which we might discuss. So I've said quite a bit already, and I'll open it up to you all. How did you guys fare with this text?
I guess I'll just ask the kind of the question that you raise at the end, which is, what does it mean for this to explain anything, let alone as much or more than other accounts of human behavior?
Well, I think you come at it negatively and say, where are the explanatory frameworks, just like some of the ones I referred to, where do they fall short? Like, what do they not help us to explain? Like, things like, why do people act against their own interest? Like, that's one thing that's difficult to explain. Like, what leads to people both, not just economic interests, right? But in your personal self-interest in your life. Like, we all do incredibly damaging things to ourselves. I think maybe the compulsion to repeat speaks more to me. Like, I can think of a number of ways in which I find myself in the same situation, and I just cannot believe that I managed to, through the ruse of my own ruse, place myself back in this situation. I just think that there are manifold phenomena that are not captured. Now, I don't look, I'm not an expert on psychoanalysis, and I couldn't say exactly how it is that psychoanalysis resolves problems in these, explanatory problems in these domains. But I think it's not very difficult to point to a ton of phenomena that are hard to explain about how twisted our motivations, our lines of action, our practical lives are, how circuitous our paths to the things that we supposedly want are. I think that that's where you need more than just, you need more than like a rational actor theory or even like a theory of self-interest to understand like how it is that what drives us to do those things.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I come at this. So first you asked, what our reactions were. At a certain point, I think, I said during our mailbox, episode, I can be very credulous with, certain texts. And at a certain point, especially when Freud is like, this is speculative, I'm like, you know what? Fuck. Let me just go with it.
Let's go on.
And what I thought was interesting here is that sometimes again more social theory is my bag and all of that, and I sometimes worry about a type of mythical psychoanalysis, say in the Afro-pessimism register. But when I took a step back and let myself go with it, one, Freud was trying to give an explanation that in essence you might think that psychoanalysis is simply about your mind, but no, he wants to talk about what desires and forces our organic bodies, experience, not just only within ourselves, but, in the environment that we find ourselves. And so what I thought was really interesting here is sometimes, when doing social theory, it can be easy to just assume we know what a subject is, how subjects will evaluate things. And, it can sometimes, tend towards assuming that there is, a relatively coherent subject, and then we can start to make predictions about what they will do, how they experience the world, etc. But, what Freud seems to be doing is saying something like, subjectivity is driven from within inside itself. That, there isn't a single subject, either rationally evaluating its choices, nor completely determined by the environment that it is in, but that subjectivity is formed by the difficult calibration between the forces inside of ourselves, the forces that I'll put it in my own language, that are driven towards activity and driven towards rest, and the constraints and impingements of the environment that we find ourselves in, which I think he calls the reality principle. And so what I was starting to think here is, even if you don't accept the entire Freudian story, what at least he is pointing towards is, so what is this thing that we call a subject that we assume we understand its actions? Why do people do these very strange things? Like, he does go really far with the repetition compulsion, where he's even like, we might be suspicious of someone who keeps marrying someone and they keep dying from an illness. Like, what's going on there? And of course, at that time I'm like, what the fuck is that? But if we dial that back a little bit, it can allow you to say something like, instead of saying that people are simply weak-willed, what if there are problems that are irresolvable at the level of subjectivity and desire because, let me put it this way, it turns out our desires and what we want isn't unitary. That they often conflict. And so it's at least trying to open that plane of investigation and not say that everything has to be resolved there, but what is this person in this environment and what type of person does it make them become? Psychoanalysis seems to be trying to put that back on the table.
Yeah, I know that we've talked about this between me and some of you before in various ways. I have a lot of difficulty with psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic concepts. I think my brain's shaped wrong to grasp it properly, and I have real difficulty thinking along with it.
I'm just going to say, low-key, I don't believe anybody that says they don't have difficulty with it.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's a false projection.
Yeah, I think its subject matter like inherently resists a certain modes of clarification.
Right. So because I've got the weird rationalist brain that I've got, I'm going to try to push for clarification anyway.
Good. Yeah, we have to.
So me and Gil will team up once again.
Yeah, hell yeah, let's do this.
The A team.
The A team.
Me and the B team.
B team.
We team a rationalist over here.
You notice how I assert the superiority of the conscious over the unconscious.
Yeah, for sure. A
immediately.
hundo P. You got to. So yeah, if this is an explanatory model of some kind, it should be predictive in a certain way. So we've got this idea of these two different principles. And maybe we could just like slow down and go back to our pleasure principle before we get to the death drive. You mentioned in your intro that it's something like the pleasure principle, that is a tendency towards like it's towards a zero state, or like a zero intensity, like a constancy of excitation, or even its decrease, right? I was reading something about this, that like Freud was, he gets a lot of shit for being pseudoscience or what have you. But like he's very, very invested in the debates and other scientific discourses in the day. I mean, this is to Will's point, like part of what's fascinating about, like, I think it's chapters 5 and 6 in this book, where he like goes off into the deep end of embryology, and he's like making these like speculative claims, but it is pretty grounded in like, the science of the day. And I was reading about the way in which he was influenced specifically by like developments in thermodynamics, where like systems have a certain kind of constant degree of energy, and then there's also a kind of entropic tendency towards dissolution, right? And the death drive seems to be something that makes
between equilibrium and disequilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's like an equilibrium, disequilibrium, and entropy problem going on here. So can anyone like help me out make sense of like, what do we mean in this context by pleasure principle? Like, why is it a tendency towards like neutralizing differences and returning to a zero state rather than, because I think a kind of more intuitive way of understanding pleasure or pleasure principle would be like, I want to maximize intensity in some way, right? Like this is, I think, how we kind of tend to spontaneously understand it, right? Like, I don't know, food or sex or joy is like an intense thing and you want to maximize that. That's not what the pleasure principle is for Freud. So what's that about?
So as Owen was talking, when I was reading, I realized that whatever Freud means by pleasure, pleasure principle, is actually very different than how we often talk about pleasure, which is this state of excitement, this state of extreme stimulus. But if Freud is right that the organism only has a certain type of capacity to be open to a certain intensity of stimuli, then I think what he's saying that actually what the organism finds pleasurable is a state of constancy and predictability. And so strangely enough, pleasure would be the ability to control the amount of stimuli that is impinging upon one, and that actually there is a type of pain in a pleasure that overcomes the subject, leads them into ecstasy, which doesn't mean that there can't be something alluring about that type of pain and loss of control. And so what he seems to be talking about with the pleasure principle is pleasure as a state of rest, as a state of minimal disturbance. And yet the contradiction or the tension there is that state of minimal disturbance starts to look frighteningly close to a state of death. Right. And there is something in our organism that wants to resist that as well, the drive to reproduce or the drive to know that we are alive. So I take it what he's doing, and this seems to be a rather banal point, is that we don't want to be overstimulated all the time. Sometimes any of you who's like an introvert, you can have a good time at a party, but there's a certain point where you're like, I just need to get the fuck home. Like this is not it for me. I need to be in bed as close to death as possible.
See, my issue is that's not me. I go to the end.
Well, there's something has been malformed in your psyche. Clearly.
Yeah, 100%, no question.
And so, just to this is a long way of trying to answer Gil's questions. What I think he's trying to say about pleasure is, a type of tranquility that the organism is striving for. But, it can never go too far in that tranquility because that would be the abolition of its life. And so I'm trying to say this in a rather common sense way of I think we all have the experience of not wanting too much, of wanting a state of predictability, a state of quiescence. I don't think that is, completely far afield from general experience.
Well, I was also going to say, just on the question of sense pleasure that you're referring to, what we normally understand by sense pleasure, he says something really interesting about the function of the sense organs, is that we normally think of the sense organs as faculties of receptivity. Like we think about their, that they can take in all of this different stimuli, and data. But he says, in actual fact, like one of the key, the important, perhaps the central job of the sense organs is actually to limit the amount that we take in, right? To limit the amount of stimulation. And if we didn't have sense organs and we were just totally it was just a deluge, right, of excitation from the external world, like we certainly wouldn't feel it as pleasure. I mean, we'd probably just die, right? But it wouldn't feel very pleasurable, right? So actually, what sense pleasure is inherently connected to limitation of excitation,
selection.
Selection.
Filtering.
Filtering. Yeah.
Here's just a quick example. I'll just say this really quickly because this popped in my head. The first time I met Owen's daughter, it was me, my partner, and our friend. And, it was quite clear she wasn't used to being around a lot of people like me. I'm a fun-ass time. Tell me why this girl's crying the entire time of me just talking to her. Me just being like, ooh, ooh, ooh. Like, I'm thinking that's what children want. Play, here's stimulus. Da, da, da. But she's like, no, make it stop. I need to be brought into the quiet. And so you might think, well, children, 100%. They get bored. They want all this stimulus. But, if we go to a baby who doesn't yet have language, hasn't been inducted into culture and our bodily practices of how to be with one another, this was complete nonsense, terror even. It was way too overwhelming.
Yeah, it's the first 5 minutes with anybody she meets now, too. It's just way too overwhelming.
I should stop screaming at babies because I think that they like intensity. But I guess I'm mistaken about this.
So that's why babies always cry when they're around. Damn. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's just starting to make sense.
So I'm just gonna reiterate Gil's question, which is just why not just a basic kind of utilitarianism and our kind of sexual or affective economy? I was just reading on utilitarianism for the upteenth time because I taught it recently, and I needed a refresh. Hadn't really read it in a couple years, and sometimes I was reading the part on pleasures and pains and what they are, and I didn't find it that silly. I don't know if that's the definition of happiness, but it was certainly not an entirely implausible way of talking about a negotiation between pleasure and pain in order to kind of have more controlled pleasures that we actually think are higher pleasures. So in some sense, just basic processes of delayed gratification and learning, achieving wisdom about superior versus inferior pleasures. This is the kind of thing that I don't know, philosophers have just been saying for a long time about pleasure. And I guess I'm a little perplexed, and forgive me for being so maybe myopic about this. I'm perplexed about the mystery that he feels he's unfolding in this inner psychic life. And I think it has to do with the insistence that we are not transparent to ourselves. So what is going on in that internal economy of pleasure and pain is not something that we actually have control over. It's not like we cultivate virtue in the utilitarian sense or even in the virtue ethical sense, and we kind of train ourselves to have better and more controlled pleasures. So I get that part of it is kind of the dark web of your psyche is and the fact that there is no linear time in the unconscious, and it's not organized, and it is just kind of mysterious forces that we can only see symptoms of. I get that that's part of the picture, but when he's talking about the pleasure principle, on the surface of it, based on what you can actually observe, I'm not ever really sure that it's something different than a basic utilitarianism about pleasures and drives.
Yeah, can I add to the question real quick? Can I just add to this because I like this question a lot, because it seems on the one hand this sort of way that he cashes it out is counterintuitive, as returning to a constancy or a baseline seems like it might be incompatible with utilitarianism. But also it might not, right? It's just that he's isolating the like origin of where that pleasure feeling comes from in a different movement than we tend to think. But then you might still pursue it in a maximalist, utilitarian, rational kind of way. But then I also wanted to agree with you by asking us to think about like the Fort Da game. Because in your introduction, Owen, I don't know if I agreed with or understand what's going on there. In the repetition of the Fort Da game, you said something like, in it, the child goes from being passive and into active in relation to this thing by repeating it. But I don't think that that's how we find, as you put it, pleasure and unpleasure, right? That would just be another pleasure principle way of making sense of this, right? Like it's not about, like it seems to me like the postulate of the death drive isn't reducible to, sometimes you endure an unpleasure for the sake of greater pleasure later. That's just like Lillian said, that's just the utilitarian calculus again, right? Like maybe a more wise or virtuous utilitarian is someone who's like, I'll give up X for Y later. But the death drive he posits for other reasons, right? He thinks that there are some sorts of psychic phenomena or social behaviors that don't even make sense on that model, right? And that's what I think needs to be understood.
Yeah. So I think the important thing about the Fort Da game, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about this, is that it's the experience of like playing Fort Da is returning to a situation that is unpleasant. Like we seek out situations that the child finds unpleasant, the experience of departure of his mother, right? And so like what the Fort Da game is not a way of like, maybe saying it's like pleasure and unpleasure is not precise enough, because it's that the game is a way to like bind the excitation, the excessive energy that comes from that experience of disappointment. It doesn't make him like happy, right? But it's a way to return to that same painful experience, but now not in a totally uncontrolled like flow of painful excitation, but now in a cultured, like bound, like experience of it. And that is, to some extent, more pleasing than just the actual raw experience of loss and departure. But it's still the experience, but now in a cultured building, like a formed like way, right, of experiencing it. Well, I just want to say one more thing before we get to, is this too far afield from Lillian's original point, which I thought was really good? That it's important to remember that psychoanalysis isn't just a theoretical domain, right? That it's a therapeutic exercise. And so I think for someone like Freud, people come back from the war and they're explaining all these neuroses, right, from World War I, or all manner of other neuroses, sadistic tendencies, masochistic tendencies. I don't know from a therapeutic perspective if you'd find it very helpful just to like open up a utilitarian text and say, no, you just got to get a little bit smarter about how you're pursuing, your pleasures and your pains. I mean, he would look at you like you're, like an absolute idiot. And maybe he doesn't have a better answer, right? Or like a more coherent, intelligible answer. But I do think the critical point there in the therapeutic context is right. I mean, that these other different models, like go make yourself smarter or make yourself stronger or make better decisions. Like that's what a lot of psychotherapy does. The most damaging kind of like psychotherapy, I think, does that, get stronger, master yourself, adapt yourself to your society. Like that's ego psychology, is all that shit.
Think better thoughts. Okay, so there are a couple things. There's so much to say, and I want to make sure we say it all because I'm imagining listeners who know a little bit of psychoanalysis are going to worry that we don't get to it. So I'm just going to list like 3 things I think are really important that I got from the Freud text. So with the utilitarian calculus bit, what I find is interesting there is the reason why Freud is not offering a type of, let's put it, an education of desire is because this assumes a model of the subject where it is the only desires are the desires that the ego attributes to itself. And so that the only pleasures and pains are, I like chocolate. I hate vanilla. But, what's going on in Freud is that there are pleasures and pains that are not strictly attributable to the conscious I. This is maybe, what's kind of frightening about what Freud is saying, which is, there is, when he's talking about drives, the best way that I'll put it, and I don't know how much sense it will make, it feels pleasure. It feels pain. And so he's trying to designate that not everything that goes on inside of us happens in the realm of conscious, rational reflection. So what this leads you to is that things that I think are pleasurable, my organism, it, may actually find painful. And so that's the first thing I want to say, is that what I think is different from the Millian utilitarianism is that there isn't an I who, through enough work, can finally be complete master of itself. There are desires and forces that, besiege the ego. I don't know if anyone has ever had the experience of like, why am I drawn to this thing? I don't want to be drawn to it. My example is like, when you're young and you're dating someone who all your friends like, he's bad for you, don't do it. And you're like, I know he is. Like, he never calls me, and I know it sucks. But then when I get that text message, I'm like, fuck, let's go. And like, that's not rational. And so one might say is like, well, look at you, you're immature or something like that. So this goes to the second thing I want to say, which is, I'm playing the role of trying to stick for Freud, just being, just like to push things a little bit. But the second thing is that there is something deeply conservative in what, in Freud's project here, where he doesn't, this is not about liberation. This is not about, finally desiring the right things. It seems to me for Freud, and this will maybe be the controversial thing I'll say for those who love psychoanalysis, is it's about adaptation. For Freud, you are an organism in an environment you cannot completely control. And it turns out what brings you pain is you're constantly trying to control these forces. You don't want mom to leave. You don't want X person to betray you again. And yet you're constantly drawn to it. And you think, I just need to change myself. And Freud is saying what you need is to have some clarity about what it is you are. And so, there is an element of psychoanalysis I can understand people from the left worrying about, which is Freud does not lead you to the notion of changing the world or changing your environment. What he leads you to is how can you generate some state of equilibrium between who you think you are, generated by culture, and like I will say for our listeners at home, all of Freud's patients were bourgeois women and men. So yes, he could be doing a sort of a class analysis of the psyche of those types of men and women, but it isn't about overthrowing those roles. It is about, coming to some sort of understanding so that you're not constantly tearing yourself apart about these strange desires that you think should not be there. At least that's my kind of controversial thing. Yeah. Like, Freud is thinking about how we're situated in environments, how they mold us, how we make sense of them. And the last thing I'll say that I think is interesting in psychoanalysis is, in the United States, we're experiencing rising rates of crime. And so sometimes I think we know that people should not choose violence, that they should not harm themselves and others. How do we explain that they do that if we don't want to make recourse to the idea that they're dupes, that they're not very smart? Well, what Freud would say is that in violent environments, you'll get malformed subjectivity. You will get people who are split between what they ought to desire and what, pushes them forward, which isn't about saying they have no responsibility. It is to say something like, it turns out environments really matter and, how subjectivity is formed. And he's like pointing that way, but I don't think like he'd have much to say about urban or rural violence for it to be like, I don't know, those are Americans. What can you do?
Those are just Americans.
Psychoanalysis can't help them. Culture isn't restrained enough. And so I just wanted to like make that point that what's like really interesting about the topology of mind here is that there is what we think of ourselves, but it's clearly for Freud, what lives within us is something that we wouldn't necessarily attribute to ourselves, yet also does determine our reactions, our behaviors. And that's like really hard because we live in a culture where you're supposed to be like, if you're unhappy, think happier thoughts, look on the bright side, eat healthier, exercise twice a day.
Just thinking about the toxicity of positive thinking earlier.
Oh, yeah.
I was thinking, can't you just let me live? Let me be myself.
I actually feel like Freud would be like, yeah, positive thinking, that is really fucking toxic. That is in no way how you are constituted. And what is this drive for constant pleasure? No. Sometimes you don't want all of that. And your organism can't handle that.
Yeah, I like that. I share a similar frustration with a lot of psychoanalytic theory when it does seem to be so heavily oriented towards like alterations in subjectivity and not alterations in the world. But I will say one thing just quick about like the therapeutic practice and what it's supposed to achieve, because I think it's clear that At least to me, although there's probably going to be some people in the audience like, wait, that's not true. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that the aim of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic practice like isn't to like make you happy and to like fix you in that sense, right? To just be like, oh, Nick, you're going to be happy now. It's to interrupt a cyclical set of repetition compulsions, is one of its functions at least. It's to interrupt and to alter the kind of trajectory of your existence and your psychic life by allowing you to be less captured by things that you yourself, by processes that you yourself can't really see and which you need an analyst to be able to see. And so, yeah, I just think it's important. It's not, it isn't toxic. It's definitely not like toxic positivity. Like you should be happy. It's just like, I see that you're stuck. Like this is how you might be able to change.
Well, he like gives a little like history of, one of the interesting things about this text is there's a couple of places where he like also looks back over the development of psychoanalytic theory and practice and kind of gives like little historical accounts of how it's shaped and developed. And this is one of the things that he says, right? Initially, it's marked by this discovery of there being an unconscious at all. And so like the first practical efforts or therapeutic efforts are like, you know, talking to a patient, trying to like see as an analyst what their unconscious like desires, habits, or tendencies are, and just like saying that to them. And he's like, that didn't work. Whoops. You know, like that didn't work at all. And then at a certain point he says like, you know, the next sort of step forward, or one of the great steps forward in it as a clinical practice is the development of this idea of transference, where again you have like a different function of repetition, right? Like there is now an attempt to get the person being analyzed to repeat the traumatic experience, like sort of their own, not in a way, it can't be remembered. It can't be remembered exactly. This is part of like the like repression dynamic, I guess, that this is all about, right? Like there's something about a traumatic experience is such that like it can't be remembered properly. It's like because it becomes like constitutive of like who you are as a subject, it's also excluded from your memory as a subject. So then like the point is to like encourage a kind of repetition of it where again there's a greater degree of mastery. So first of all, I want to know if
he says the goal is to remember it,
yeah.
not to keep it. The problem with repetition is that you keep experiencing it again as if it were presently happening to you because you can't remember it properly. And the therapeutic goal is to remember it, the traumatic event, instead of reliving it all your life.
Yeah, I think like, you know, the sort of Lacanian way of saying is to integrate it into your symbolic so that it becomes something that is, you know, representable to you, sensible to you, which doesn't mean that you can make it so it never happened, but it's no longer just a domineering compulsion that, you know, you unthinkingly continue to reconstitute.
No longer the organizing force of your psychic life.
I mean, so here's the question of what's going on with, you know, what Freud is doing here. And this is a genuine question that I have, and maybe, Owen, you might be better served to answer this. It's hard to see what a politics of psychoanalysis could be. It seems as if, you know, at least with Freudian psychoanalysis, is really rooted in the clinical practice. So I can see, you know, let me just like say what's on my mind. I don't know if I'd like to see a version of psychoanalysis where social organizing and unions are walking in with Freud and like, comrade, it seems like you have some resistances here.
No.
Might we work through this? Like, I don't see that. But, you know, it seems to me that what, you know, Freud...
No cultural revolution for you.
yeah, back to the office with you. No. You're not ready for revolution. But I see that, you know, and maybe we'll read some of the people who tried to do left political appropriations of Freud is, you know, there was really important here's this notion of resistances. And so what some people try to do with Freud is to say something along the lines of why is it, let me just speak abstractly, revolutionary consciousness isn't generating? What are the blockages? Why is it that, you know, we find ourselves repeating and wedded to structures that actively harm us? Now, of course, we can say there are objective constraints, but that doesn't explain why sometimes we experience these structures that harm us as pleasurable, as something that, you know, we want, that as something that circumscribes our horizon of what possibilities are. And so one might say that what this could lead to is to make us maladapted to what we take to be a set-in-stone environment, and to try to explain how it is we become quiescent in, you know, environments that are actively toxic for us, that harm us, etc. And so to say that those resistances that we think are simply in the psyche, it turns out those resistances are objectively generated and, part and parcel to the environments in which we find ourselves.
I'll just say, like, I think I don't have that much to add about, like, specific psychoanalytic concepts. I find a lot of them to be, like, very enigmatic. But, like, when I'm reading Freud, I do find something about them intuitive as well. I just want to, like, return to the question about what it explains, because I hear what you're saying, Owen, that, like, the response is, like, so many possible things. But that always seems like never true to me. It seems like the speculative part of it is, like, that's the part of the program where we try to explain things. And for the most part, that's pretty difficult to do. And I'm not trying to knock it. It's just that when I ask what does it explain, I'm actually, like, I'm just skeptical about scaling up some internal processes within the human psyche into any kind of explanation about society. Like, it's not obvious to me that in aggregate, human society is the kind of thing that the psyche is. And mostly what you're doing if you're explaining things in the psyche, like what you do in a therapeutic setting, whether it's like psychoanalytic or some other psychotherapy, it is a kind of explanation, but it's by nature not the type of explanation that is being given in the social sciences or that is trying to anticipate human behavior in that way. It strikes me as a disanalogy for the most part. And when I hear, like, when I read feminist work or theorizing about race, that really, like, it always seems like a massive projection onto individuals, these kinds of, like, psychodynamic patterns that the theorist has found intuitive. And it feels like it's starting to read reality like a text, like you would read your own life in the therapeutic setting. And if you buy that that's possible, then I understand why it's attractive. But I just don't. And so there's this, like, sympathy I have toward thinking about individuals in this way. But I'm deeply skeptical of, like, the scaling up of these problems, because there's kind of like I'm positive there's, like, a logical fallacy for this, which is just that, like, if you think, like, it feels like a non sequitur, like, okay, so this seems like it's true about the individuals in the clinical setting, but then it also must be true if we kind of seem to see similar things in aggregate that we can neither test nor measure nor. Anyway, that's like kind of
I love that you said it that way. I'll just be really quick with this. So what is, like, really kind of shocking with psychoanalysis is I actually think we lose a psychoanalytic insight when we simply do just try to scale it up to society. So let me also put my cards on the table here. I don't understand how a discourse like Afro-pessimism that leans so much on psychoanalysis, why is psychoanalysis explanatory once it loses any connection to the clinical setting? So say what you want about Freud and how speculative he was, but he was in the clinical setting. So what becomes a psychoanalysis once it's no longer actually grounded in this practice? And Freud and other places, he talks about that there is a relationship between theory and practice here. So once you just lose the practice, you just have theory. And I think even Freud would be like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Then now you're just like, you're going off the dome. But what I think is interesting about the insight is that there's a type of short circuit here where it turns out what social science describes, the complex environment, is not completely analogous to how the individual organism responds to that environment. And so this is more of a speculative question. What's fascinating with what is happening with psychoanalysis is psychoanalysis also seems to be saying that there is a conservative tendency in the organism to resist or protect itself from the immense complexity of the environment it finds itself in. If that is true, then the organism can't be an explanation for the environment because that's the very thing it's trying to protect itself from. So it seems like the political question to me is, how do we think in our increasingly complex society how individuals can be engaged in the gargantuan gargantuan process or project of changing something that is, for any individual, overwhelming. Now, the easy pat answer is, of course, collective action. But I think psychoanalysis is introducing this, this difficulty of how one gets from A to C. And I'm designating B as that disanalogous place of the complexity of social society and the organism's tendency to resist being overwhelmed with complexity. If I can, I'll just...
Yeah, there is one part of Afro-pessimism that I have been like struck by, one use of psychoanalysis that, and I haven't settled on what to make of it, but I do keep thinking about it, which is the claim that like with the oppression of Black people and the systematic violence against Black people in the United States, that there is more at stake than maybe just political economy, and you can't understand the like, I don't know how to put it, the fury with which violence is brought down on Black people without seeing some libidinal investment in that violence, that there's a libidinal economy that extends beyond just, well, capital needs this, it needs, giving just a purely kind of, I don't know, classically historical materialist explanation for like why mass incarceration exists and why there is police violence, like that there is some investment in that violence that goes beyond just an economic investment in that violence. Do you know what I mean? And I worry about going down that route, and I don't go down that route because I worry about where it leads. I think it leads to obscurantism. I don't know how you can falsify or verify. Like, that's what I wanted to say to you, Lillian, is I don't know how you falsify or verify observations like that. They spark my interest, and I'm like, okay, well, how do we prove that that's at work there? And you're like, well, just look at Derek Chauvin's face or something. You know what I mean? Like, you can't, I don't know. Yeah, you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
So maybe this is something for like, I don't know, maybe further inquiry. But when I hear you say that there just has to be something beyond that, my answer is, of course there is. Like, I'm very complicated. Like, I know that I don't understand myself completely, and there are various like parts of my psyche that create compulsions and needs that I, to the best of my ability, try to accommodate with respect for others. But none of that, like, I think that the explanatory question isn't about denial of, like, it sounds like from what you're saying that there's like a big impression that the concept of like excess makes. I don't mind excess that much. Like, it's not something that bothers me as a part of social explanation because I think the non sequitur is like thinking that like the excess means like something more than excess. Like, obviously everything I do is in excess of the decisions I make in my career. But none of those excesses prevent me from making the decisions I make in my career for the most part.
Or do they exercise any causal power, I guess would be a question.
Well, they do, but like the point, like the problem of falsification is the problem of like, just over determination. It's like, yeah, it has some causal power in my choice of partner and my choice of friends and the things I enjoy, the TV I watch, the food I like, the things I do for relief or for pleasure. Like, it has tons of causal power in my life. Mm-hmm. But the question is, what are you trying to explain? And like, none of those things are going to explain why when I pop out a baby, I am suddenly confronted with like all of these decisions that, regardless of all of those other complicated things about me, I can't change based on those complicated things about me. So there's this kind of like, my point is that the idea that the social whole is somehow a magnified version of the internal psyche and the kinds of pressures it then places on us, I think they're incongruous in some significant sense, which doesn't mean that there's nothing more to explain for me. Like, if you told me that the only things about me were like the homo economicus stuff, I'd be like, fuck you. That's obviously not true about me.
Yeah.
Nor is it true about you or anyone else. So like there's just some slippages in the way, like, what are you trying to explain? What kind of object are you talking about? What kind of scope does it have? And like, normally when I read psychoanalytic stuff, those are exactly the questions that go unanswered. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like the excess and the mystery of it all becomes what is impressive about the theory as opposed to its predicative power or something.
I agree with that, actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it has a real seductive power because of that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I brought up like what happens when it's completely unlinked from clinical practice. Because when it's completely unlinked from clinical practice, you lose the question of scope.
That's great. I think that one of the things that strikes me here is Freud himself is always talking about like organisms and the relationship between organism and inorganic life, the inorganic nature. And like, I think about this a lot, coming at this from a completely different angle, like Matheron, who I translate out Spinoza. Spinoza doesn't seem to think there's any real difference in kind between, for instance, an individual and like an organization that they belong to, right? These are both things with a certain degree of individuality that have a sort of striving of their own nature, and they pursue whatever it is. I think Freud is someone for whom like that is a bananas thought, right? And like there's something specific to like the individuality of an organism, right? This is why we get all that like weird discussion about like forming a cortical layer, protective shell. You've got like a nervous system, and like a collective organization, a social group doesn't have that. You know, it develops defense mechanisms, but they look really different because they're not like a nervous system's attempt to safeguard the individuality of an organism. So like this scaling up problem that Lillian's pointing to, like I think is internal to Freud's own methodology, right? He himself, I think, would be very worried about maybe at a later date we can look at like the group psychology essay because it doesn't. I was just going to mention, yeah. It doesn't have the same logic at all. And I think you're right that like there's this like slippage and a lot of like later.
Well, he says in the group psychology that individual psychology is always group psychology, and group psychology is always individual psychology. And yeah.
I mean, that's right.
I don't know it well enough to understand exactly how that works, but he does. It is something that he claims.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the other thing is like this also isn't to say that these things are like totally disarticulated or irrelevant to one another, right? Like the fact that if my individual psychology as an organism is going to have these like weird sort of mechanisms of like, I don't know, bound and unbound cathexis, or like, I've got a certain amount of psychic energy that I can only move around. And then if I get hit with a trauma over here, I'm going to like lose some of the other important functions that my mind is doing to try to like react to that. Okay, that if that's true, cool. And this might change the sort of story or picture that we get about what happens when people like that get together, which isn't the same as saying that like that collective organism or collective organization is going to have the same sort of logic at work, right? So like the scale up problem is interesting. And I think if I could like toss this out to you guys as a question, one way of like asking how to think through this is something like he uses the language of economy quite a bit in these texts. And I wondered if you all had ideas about what the relationship is between psychic economy and political economy. Like, is this more than just an analogy, or like what's going on here? Yeah.
All right, I'm going to say the thing like I almost forgot it. It's the thing that I would have hated if I didn't get to say. I think that there's actually a very real disanalogy between political economy and psychic economy, even for Freud. So here's my interpretation of Freud, and so Freudians can get at me.
Let's go.
Freudian psychoanalysis is intrinsically conservative. What I do not mean is that Freud thinks something like subjugation of women is great, or Freud thinks that black people aren't human. I don't know, maybe Freud thought those individual things. That's not what I mean. What I mean is something like this. What seems to be a central point in Freudian psychoanalysis is that there actually are real limits to the capacity for the individual organism to change and adapt. In other words, what I mean is I do not think Freud thinks that we can just become anything whatsoever. Why I think there's a disanalogy. What Freud is maybe seeing at a particular moment in shifts in global economy and in capitalism, et cetera, is that it turns out political economy, society, whatever, has a greater capacity for transformation and change than the individual can keep up with. So let me just try to say this as clearly as possible. In other words, objective processes like economy, et cetera, do not have the same problem of having to constrain their desires or conserve their nervous system as we as individuals have. And so what you have is an increasing disanalogy between the individual and their libidinal economy that does have very real limits of what it can adapt to, and what turns out to be a social totality that doesn't have those same limits. And what you would need to explain is how human action remains remains possible, in sort of an economic process that's continually exceeding what that individual can adapt to. And one name we could possibly give this is alienation. And so the reason why I say there's something intrinsic conservative is that there is a pessimism for you in psychoanalysis. If you're a utopian, you think, well, we just need to change all society and then we'll be different people. Freudian psychoanalysis will come in and say something along the lines of, there are actually limits to how much you can just change an organism given its environment. Organisms are destroyed by their environments all the time.
Yeah.
They are
He says that in Civilization is Discontents.
Habermas wrote about this in 73 before Legitimation Crisis, the earliest essay, and maybe it is in Legitimation Crisis, I just forgot, but an early essay on what does crisis mean today, in advanced capitalism at that time. One of his fault lines of crisis tendencies is the increasing inability of personality structures to adapt to increasing complexity of system structures. The one, and he doesn't call it alienation, but I think that's sort of the idea. So I think, and he also had more affinity for psychoanalysis. The early Habermas was more working with that explicitly. So I think that alienation problem is something that hasn't been pursued that much, and that is kind of a interesting tack to take. So how does maybe the more relevant question is how does the individual organism try to adapt by controlling some parts of its environment? And in my I as people know, I dislike culture. I hate culture. I never write about culture, and I don't think it's important.
Hate culture.
No more culture. Kill the culture in you.
However,
I thought Stuart Hall resolved this for us.
Yeah.
right. Just so you know, I think it's unimportant, and if you are preoccupied with it, you are missing the boat. But I wrote an article that'll come out next year in Hypatia called Marx Malthus and the Moral Economy of Reproduction. And it is some of my more speculative cultural stuff, but it's in the terrain of just more straightforwardly how people respond to system crises in terms of forming ideas about who is responsible for them, namely women, anxieties about fertility and family form, and so on. And I think there is something to say about discharging one's lack of ability to control these changes in phenomena, and this can create real social effects. So there is something to explain, reactionary conservative movements and so on and so forth. But that just never quite scales up to the reason people are insecure about the family form is not just because of that problem of the personality structure or the drives. It's capitalism has changed, and the organism is dealing with it in really complicated ways. So I guess, I don't know, I'm just kind of supporting what Will is saying, that there is a really interesting thing to talk about. It's just not, to me, a congruous set of social causes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that if we think about Fanon's use of psychoanalysis, right? Fanon looked at the effects of colonialism and basically the kind of psychic mutilation, right? That is wrought by something like colonialism. But he was a practitioner of psychoanalytic therapy, and I don't think, or I can't point to, maybe some of you guys know Fanon better than I do, point to somewhere where you could see something like psychoanalytic therapy being scaled up and writ large to okay, everybody that was previously colonized. There is an extent to which, and this is I'm more sympathetic with, that practical changes, political changes, revolutionary changes, anti-colonial struggle will do a lot of the therapeutic work in a certain way that needs to be done. But then again, I don't know. Then you're very far away from just what at least Freud understands by psychoanalytic therapy, an analyst and an analysand in a specific situation with transference and all of that. This is where I totally agree with the scaling up problem. I see, when I say explanatory salience, I see that you can't. It's important to be able to understand psychic effects of something like colonialism, but I don't think you can scale up the therapeutic part of it, is how I would put it, right? I think in order to understand neuroses in a given society, you have to understand the social, economic, political conditions that are partly responsible for generating those neuroses, and those pathologies, right? Which if you look at the states, there's no shortage of pathology, individual and social pathology. But the therapeutic part of analysis,
Before we started
I completely agree.
Before we started recording, by the way, Lillian was talking about the American need to kill.
The American need to just kill.
Yeah, there are social pathologies.
We're healthy people.
And I will concede there are some things that just require some pathologizing for us to get our heads wrapped around it. Like there's no the mass death just regulally and for fun is just something I don't think.
Yeah, I completely
around,
agree though that whatever a kind of like psychoanalytically informed response to that would be, so the scaling up and making psychoanalysis as like a therapeutic process political has never really made sense to me, and I don't know that it can make sense. And so, that's helpful for me to clarify what I think is important in the social political register and where it's actually perilous if you take it there.
So here's another thing that here's an interesting question to me. So take the phenomena of mass shootings. There is a sense in which you can develop a structural explanation of the conditions in which this occurs. But this is undoubtedly like an excessive violence, like you were talking about before. To me, if you were going to develop a psychoanalytic explanation, you would have to just be awfully careful in exactly how localized and circumscribed that explanation is. Because I think that's the issue with the conservative nature of the therapeutic setting. It's like if you actually want to be careful, you can't speculate that wildly and in general, because not all societies are enacting these acts of mass death and massacre on one another. Actually, that's a special problem that Americans have in a way. So the only thing you could do is say well, every culture has some way of just murdering each other. So this is kind of typical.
Renee Girard has entered the chat. My man's just there's got to be a scapegoat. Sorry for the Girard fans.
Maybe, right? But there's a reason that we're okay, well, that's not explaining anything. Right. That's an awfully pessimistic view of human nature. So if you actually wanted to try to get at what is it, what are the excitations and problems and pathologies that are leading to this, you would just have to be awfully constrained in what you are trying to say about the psychological profile and so on.
I just want to quickly follow up on that because, this is my last-ditch effort to get someone like Gil on board. What if we say something like psychoanalysis is the site that registers effects, but psychoanalysis goes wrong when we think that it is actually an analysis of causes. And so I could see that what could be productive about psychoanalysis is you're looking at the effects that the environment can have on subjectivity, but you are not saying something like the pathologies of individual subjectivity is what explains a social arrangement of affairs. And so it can be important to understand the effects of particular pathological environments, but you shouldn't get it twisted and think, well, the pathological environment is due to something, the distortion of individual subjectivity. And just two other quick things, because Owen brought up Fanon. I just wanted to do a little teaser for the audience. One, Fanon did come to this insight. This is partially why he resigned from the psychiatric hospital in Algeria, where he realized, I'm trying to heal these people, but then I just send them back to, a completely violent, fucked up environment. Yeah. Why would I expect there to be any change? This is clearly not going to be the site of social transformation. And the other quick thing, and maybe I kind of misunderstood what you said, Owen, but I actually think Fanon did not think that revolution substituted for psychological healing. In some ways, he thought it was necessary, but he also thought that the havoc it wreaks on the environment, especially violence, is going to register other distortive effects in subjectivity, which is why Wretched of the Earth ends with this profile of these destroyed individuals who are repeating this violence. And so I think for Fanon, there's still this constant disanalogy between the political steps necessary and the effects on personality structure. And I just wanted to say that because I think some ways of reading Fanon are reading him as a psychoanalytic revolutionary, and I think that misses the
I didn't
delicacy.
mean to suggest that. I meant to more insist that there was a break between the revolutionary part of him and the
Let me just say real fast in response to what Will was saying about trying to get me on board last time. I will defend Freud at least in as much as there is a certain sort of image of scientific knowledge production that becomes dominant throughout the 20th century, which is sorry to the Liam crew, like positivist in a kind of, which I mean in a derogatory way, which is like
Positive
parentheses derogatory, where it's like the only business of scientific inquiry is just cataloging facts and looking for statistical correlations. Freud thinks that that's not adequate. He thinks that if, you want to do a science of the psyche, if you want to do psychology, that like it's just not enough just to like compile lists of things. You need to have this speculative moment. You need to have this moment where you posit something, where you're trying to go beyond the phenomena to develop something that can attempt to unify and synthesize these facts, which is why he doesn't just say like people are having weird dreams. He's like, there is a repetition compulsion, right? Like that's a different step. And like, better or worse, he's trying to bring this speculative moment to bear in the context of trying to make sense of complicated and seemingly irrational and apparently unsystematic psychic phenomena. And I think that this is, why you can call it unscientific and say it's not falsifiable. But on the other hand, he is trying to develop something like, he's trying to figure out what sorts of principles would be necessary to unify and synthesize these disparate phenomena, which I think is an important move.
Well, I will say just one last thing on that point is that there isn't a way in which psychoanalysis does seek after causes, but maybe it's just like a truncated part of the causal chain. It doesn't go further enough back into social and historical causes, because the way that psychoanalysts like to differentiate what they do from like other forms of therapy is that they think other forms of therapy are just like, all they do is try to like treat symptoms. Like they just like, listen, here's how you can think better. Here's how you can push those bad thoughts out of your head or whatever. And they think they're saying, no, I can tell you why you're having this bad thought all the time. Let's go to the cause. Like, let's go to the actual root and address that. But I think your point still stands, because in order to actually understand the cause, you'd have to go further out than just the subject's psyche. You have to understand social causes, historical causes, all of those kinds of things. And there, I don't really think that psychoanalysis is like maybe that helpful for doing that.
That's why you got to read Anti-Oedipus. That's what they're doing in that book.
Oh, I knew. I was waiting. I was surprised it didn't come up earlier. I forgot your whole original, like your origin story is like fuck psychoanalysis. Like that was your first.
No,
Anti-Oedipus
that's not what the book says. The book doesn't say fuck psychoanalysis. It says if you want to get to causes, you got to take social, historical, political conditions into account.
I know. And actually, I do love that. All right. Well, that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Christian, Jake Webb, Katie Nemkovich, Chris Nine, James Waite, Redline, Kara Whitlock. Shout out to Redline, by the way. Hope that's a Chicago reference. Valentine Wiesner, Benjamin West, Lucas G, Ian Edwards, Ruben Lopez, Malcolm Hamilton, Dylan Carlson, A, Holly B, Oscar Heath, Alan Rager, Max Gruguch, Ryan Baker. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store linked on our website. Follow us on Twitter @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.